The week after a raise arrives, something predictable happens that has nothing to do with the actual number that landed in the account. A friend who's never asked to borrow money suddenly does. A family member starts joking, not entirely joking, that dinner's on you from now on. A coworker corners you with an investment opportunity that only seems to work if you're the one funding it. None of that happened because anyone saw a bank statement. It happened because something about how the raise showed up, a new car, an offhand comment at a gathering, a slightly nicer version of ordinary life, sent a signal, and other people responded to the signal, not the number behind it. That's a cost of visible wealth almost nobody talks about, and it's a real part of why some of the wealthiest people you'll ever meet go out of their way to make sure you never see it. Picture two neighbors on the same street. One drives a leased luxury SUV, wears visibly expensive clothes, and just got back from a trip everyone saw on social media. The other drives a 10-year-old sedan with a small dent in the bumper, wears the same handful of plain t-shirts, and hasn't posted a vacation photo in years. If you had to guess which one has more money, the driveway wouldn't actually tell you. And that's the point. The gap between how wealthy someone looks and how wealthy someone actually isn't rare. It's common enough that understanding it changes the way you look at money. It's also one of the more counterintuitive things you can learn because almost everything in modern culture, from advertising to social media, is quietly built around the opposite assumption that visible spending is a reliable signal of financial success. It usually isn't, and the gap between the assumption and the reality, plus the very real cost of closing that gap the wrong way, the way the cousin and the coworker from a moment ago just illustrated, is exactly what this video is about. Before I go further, I want to be precise about what this video is and isn't about, because the title is provocative on purpose, and I don't want it misread. This isn't about actual poverty, and it isn't a video that romanticizes going without. Poverty isn't a strategy, it's a circumstance, often not a choice at all, and nothing here is about pretending otherwise. This is about something narrower and, frankly, less discussed. People who have real financial means choosing not to visibly display them, on purpose, as a deliberate part of how they build and keep wealth. Looking poor here means something closer to declining to signal wealth you actually have, not anything about the experience of genuinely not having enough. Keep that distinction in mind for everything that follows. Here's the contradiction at the center of this. The visible signals people associate with being rich, the car, the clothes, the constant upgrades, are often the exact behaviors working against someone actually becoming rich. And the behaviors that look the least impressive from the outside, driving an old car, living in a smaller house than you could technically afford, saying no to visible upgrades, are common among people who've actually built real wealth. That's not just folklore. It was one of the central patterns Stanley and Danko documented in their research on American millionaires. The most well-known version of this comes from a study conducted decades ago by researchers Thomas Stanley and William Danko, who set out to study America's millionaires and started, reasonably, by surveying people in expensive neighborhoods. What they found surprised them enough to change the direction of their entire research. Many of the people living in those expensive neighborhoods, surrounded by the visible markers of wealth, weren't actually wealthy at all. They had high incomes. The money just left as fast as it arrived, spent on the house, the cars, and the lifestyle that made the income visible. The people who actually had accumulated wealth, assets exceeding what their income alone would predict, often showed up somewhere far less conspicuous. Modest neighborhoods, driving unremarkable cars, and wearing unremarkable clothes. The wealth was real. It just wasn't on display. Stanley and Danko gave a name to the split they kept finding. People who accumulated far more wealth than their income would predict, and people who accumulated far less. Two people earning identical incomes could land on opposite sides of that split entirely, and the visible signals, the house, the car, the clothes, tended to point in exactly the wrong direction. The person who looked more prosperous from the outside was, more often than the folklore suggests, the one with less actually behind them. Stanley and Danko reported that roughly 80% of the millionaires they studied were first-generation affluent, having built their position themselves over decades of unremarkable, repeated decisions rather than one dramatic financial move. None of that is a story about willpower or genius. It's closer to a story about which decisions each of them decided were worth being visible. That pattern hasn't gone away. A recent Northwestern Mutual study on American millionaires found that 79% described their wealth as self-made, not inherited, and, more tellingly for this topic, only 36% of people who've actually crossed the million-dollar mark in investable assets consider themselves wealthy at all. That number is worth sitting with for a second, because it's not just a quirk of modesty. Most of the popular image of what wealthy looks like, the visible spending, the effortless upgrades, the lifestyle without limits, was built by people who mostly aren't the ones actually holding the assets. So when someone who's genuinely crossed the million-dollar threshold compares their own life to that popular image, of course the comparison comes up short. They're comparing their actual, unglamorous accumulation against a performance that was never real in the first place, and getting the entirely predictable result of feeling like they haven't made it, even though the numbers say otherwise. And that restraint shows up in how many wealthy households describe their own financial behavior too. In an earlier Northwestern Mutual study, 78% of millionaires described themselves as disciplined financial planners. Not flashy, not improvisational, just consistent, over a long enough period that consistency turned into a number. So why would someone with real money choose to look like they don't have it? The answer isn't a personality quirk. It's a mechanism, and once you see the mechanism, the behavior stops looking strange and starts looking like simple math. Before getting to that mechanism, it's worth asking a different question first. Why does the visible version of wealth dominate our perceptions so completely when the research keeps pointing the other way? Part of the answer is simple sampling bias. You can't see someone's brokerage statement, their 401k balance, or their paid-off mortgage. You can see their car, their clothes, and their vacation photos. Every impression you form about who's doing well is built entirely out of the fraction of a person's finances that happens to be visible, which means the sample you're working from is systematically skewed toward the people spending the most on visibility, not the people who actually have the most. Social media accelerates this considerably because the entire format rewards the visible over the actual. A vacation gets photographed, a maxed-out retirement account does not, and an algorithm has no way to distinguish a purchase made from real financial security from one made on a credit card carrying a balance that won't be paid off this month. Scroll through any feed for 10 minutes and you'll see dozens of purchases and almost no balance sheets, which quietly trains the brain to treat looks successful and is successful as the same category, even though nothing about the feed itself was ever built to make that distinction. The result is a distorted sample size problem happening constantly, at scale, in a format specifically designed to reward the version of wealth that's easiest to display rather than the version that's actually accumulating. Economists have a name for spending that exists primarily to be seen: conspicuous consumption, a term coined by the economist Thorstein Veblen more than a century ago to describe purchases made less for their use and more for what they signal to other people about your status. The mechanism is straightforward once you name it. A car is transportation, but a car that costs 3 times as much as a comparable one that gets you to the same places is transportation plus a signal, proof, visible to other people, that you can afford the extra. The same logic applies to clothes, watches, vacations, and the specific neighborhood someone chooses to live in relative to what they could actually afford elsewhere. None of that spending is irrational. It's doing exactly what it's designed to do, communicating status to other people. The problem is what it costs to send that signal, and what that money could have done instead. Let's put a number on that. because the abstract version undersells how large this gap actually becomes. Picture two people earning the exact same income, $70,000 a year, over a 30-year career. One of them spends visibly, higher car payments or leases, more expensive clothing, frequent upgrades, and other lifestyle costs that don't meaningfully build financial assets. The other lives closer to how they lived before the raises started arriving and redirects that same difference, say $1,500 a month that would otherwise have gone toward those visible upgrades, into a broad, low-cost index fund instead. At a historical average return somewhere around the market's long-term norm, that redirected $1,500 a month, invested consistently over 30 years, doesn't just add up. It compounds into a difference measured in the hundreds of thousands of dollars by the time both of them reach the same age, even though both of them earned the exact same amount of money across their entire careers. Same income, same 30 years, a completely different net worth, and the only variable that changed was which one of them the money was spent to impress. The mechanism behind that gap isn't exotic. It's just what happens when money is given decades instead of years to work. The first person's $1,500 bought consumption and experiences in the present, real in the moment, spent to be seen or simply spent, and then gone the way spending is. The second person's bought financial assets that remained invested and had decades to compound, shares in companies that didn't just sit there, but earned returns, and then the next year, those returns earned returns of their own, on top of the new contributions still arriving every month. By year 30, most of that final balance isn't even the original contributions. It's growth on growth on growth. A snowball that only exists because the money was never spent in year 1, 2, or 15. That's the actual cost of the visible version. It isn't just the dollar amount spent, it's every year of compounding that dollar amount never got the chance to do afterward. There's a second mechanism at work here, and it's less about math and more about the social cost of being visibly wealthy, which most content about money doesn't talk about honestly. It's also the mechanism behind the raise scenario from the very start of this video. The friend who suddenly needs a loan, the coworker with the investment pitch. Neither of those was a coincidence. Visible wealth changes how other people treat you, and not always in ways that help. Friends start expecting you to pick up the check. Family members start asking for loans that are quietly understood to never be repaid. Acquaintances start pitching business ideas and investment schemes specifically because you look like someone who can fund them. None of this is anyone behaving maliciously. It's a fairly predictable response to a visible signal, the same way a store with an expensive-looking storefront gets approached differently than one that looks modest. The people who deliberately keep their wealth invisible aren't just opting out of a status game. Many of them are avoiding becoming, in a very literal sense, an easier target for other people's financial expectations. There's a third mechanism, and this one is closer to a trap than a choice: lifestyle inflation, the tendency for spending to rise automatically alongside income until the visible markers of a higher income become the new baseline, and going backward from that baseline starts to feel like a loss rather than simply a return to how things used to be. Someone gets a raise, upgrades the apartment, upgrades the car, and within a year, the new baseline feels normal. Not luxurious, just normal. The next raise repeats the cycle. Nothing about any single decision in that sequence looks reckless in isolation. Each individual upgrade is affordable at the moment it happens, but the cumulative effect is a lifestyle that expands to consume exactly as much as the income allows, which means the gap between income and actual wealth never gets a chance to open up, no matter how many raises arrive. Part of why this cycle is so hard to notice from the inside is a well-documented pattern called hedonic adaptation, the tendency for the emotional lift from any upgrade to fade back down to a fairly stable baseline within a matter of weeks or months. The bigger apartment feels exciting for a while, and then it just feels like home, the same way the old apartment used to. The nicer car stops feeling nicer and starts just feeling like the car. The upgrade doesn't keep paying emotional dividends the way it seemed like it would when it was purchased. It resets to baseline, and the only way to feel that same lift again is another upgrade. That's the mechanical trap underneath lifestyle inflation. The visible spending doesn't even reliably deliver the lasting satisfaction it was bought for, which makes the whole cycle a worse trade than it appears to be in the moment of any individual purchase. People who deliberately look poor relative to their actual income are, in effect, refusing to let that baseline shift, keeping the gap between what they earn and what they visibly spend wide enough that something is left over to actually build wealth with. I want to pause here and handle the fairness of this honestly, because I think content on this topic tends to swing too far in one direction. This isn't an argument that visible spending is always foolish, or that anyone who buys a nice car or takes a nice vacation is making a mistake. Money that's actually yours to spend, spent on things that genuinely add value to your life, isn't a financial error. It's the entire point of having money in the first place. The distinction that actually matters isn't spending versus not spending. It's spending to signal status to other people versus spending because something genuinely improves your life, and being honest with yourself about which one is actually happening in a given purchase. Someone with a fully funded retirement, no debt, and real financial security who chooses to drive a nice car because they enjoy driving is making a completely different decision than someone financing that same car on a stretched budget specifically because of how it will be perceived by neighbors and coworkers. Same car, completely different financial reality behind it. A useful, honest question to ask about any purchase that's partly about how it looks. Would I still want this exact thing if nobody else would ever see it? Sometimes the answer is genuinely yes, and that's worth knowing. Sometimes the honest answer is no, and that's worth knowing too. It's also worth naming the failure mode on the other end. Because extreme, joyless frugality has real costs too, even when the bank balance looks impressive. Someone who underspends so aggressively that they never take a vacation, never replace something that's genuinely broken, or never spend money on relationships and experiences that matter to them isn't necessarily building a healthier financial life. They might just be building a bigger number while quietly missing out on the actual purpose money is supposed to serve. There's a specific version of this worth naming directly. Someone who accumulates a large net worth but delays every form of enjoyment indefinitely, always waiting for enough, never actually arriving at a point where the number in the account translates into a better lived life. That's not the outcome this video is describing as a win. Deliberately downplaying visible wealth during the years when you're actually building it is a strategic choice with a clear payoff. Refusing to ever enjoy that wealth once it exists is a different problem entirely, and this video isn't an argument for that. There's a psychological piece underneath all of this worth naming directly because it explains why the people who most consistently avoid conspicuous spending often seem the least bothered by not spending it. Status anxiety, the discomfort of feeling like you rank lower than people around you, tends to drive a lot of visible consumption because visible spending is one of the fastest ways to signal rank to people who can't see your actual bank balance. Someone who's already secure in their financial position and secure in how they see themselves independent of what other people think has less need for that signal in the first place. The spending isn't being suppressed through willpower. It's just not filling a need that was never particularly strong to begin with. That's a very different internal experience than gritting your teeth through deprivation, and it's part of why this pattern tends to be self-sustaining once it's established, rather than something people have to fight against every day. Let's clear up a few misconceptions this idea tends to attract, because they get tangled together often enough to be worth separating cleanly. The first misconception is that this is about being cheap to other people, refusing to tip, splitting every bill down to the cent, treating generosity as a leak in the system. It isn't. Deliberately downplaying your own visible lifestyle and being ungenerous with others are two completely unrelated behaviors that sometimes get bundled together under the same frugal label, and the research on wealth accumulators doesn't actually support that bundling. Plenty of people who live modestly are quietly generous in ways that just aren't visible either, the same way their wealth isn't. The second misconception is that this only works for people with high incomes, so it doesn't apply until you're already earning a lot. The principle can apply across a wide range of incomes, but the size of the gap someone can realistically create depends heavily on income and essential costs. Someone whose paycheck is mostly consumed by housing, food, transportation, healthcare, and childcare has far less room to work with than someone whose essentials leave a comfortable margin. What stays consistent across that range isn't the size of the gap, it's the principle behind it. Avoiding unnecessary status spending matters at whatever scale is actually available, even when that scale is small. The third misconception is that stealth wealth means literally lying about your finances, claiming poverty you don't have, or being dishonest with people who have a legitimate reason to know your actual situation, like a spouse or a financial planner. It doesn't mean that either. It means simply not volunteering information or performing a lifestyle that isn't actually true to your priorities. There's a real difference between not broadcasting something and actively deceiving someone about it. A fourth misconception is that this idea applies uniformly regardless of context, when in practice, some visible spending is genuinely functional rather than purely a status signal. Someone whose income depends on looking a certain way, certain sales roles, certain client-facing professions, isn't necessarily falling into the same trap by maintaining a polished appearance. That spending is closer to a business expense than a status purchase, and the honest test is still the same one from a moment ago. Would this expense make sense even if it had no effect on how anyone perceived you professionally? Sometimes the answer is yes, because the professional effect is the actual point, and that's a different category of spending than upgrading a car nobody depends on you upgrading. If any part of the last few minutes felt uncomfortably familiar, if you recognized your own car, your own upgrades, your own reasons for the last few purchases in the description of visible spending rather than the description of the person building wealth quietly, that's not a verdict on anything you've already done. Nobody's finances are fixed at a single point in time, and the gap this video is describing isn't something you either have or permanently don't. It's something that opens or closes with the next decision, not the last one. The version of this that actually matters going forward isn't a full accounting of every purchase made up to now. It's a single, honest question applied to whatever comes next. Is this for me, or is this for who's watching? This isn't a new tension either, even if the specific vocabulary is recent. Older money has quietly operated this way for generations. The phrase old money itself often describes families whose wealth is real but deliberately unshowy, in contrast to newly wealthy people whose spending patterns are still catching up to their bank balance and haven't yet settled into invisibility. What's changed more recently is just the branding. What used to simply be called frugality or discretion now circulates online under labels like quiet luxury or stealth wealth, repackaged for a culture that's more visually documented than any before it. The underlying behavior, spending in a way that doesn't announce itself, isn't new. What's new is that it now has to actively resist a media environment specifically engineered to reward the opposite. Some of the most visible examples of this, ironically, are some of the wealthiest people alive. Warren Buffett, one of the richest investors in the world, has lived in the same modest house he bought decades before he became famous for his wealth, worth a small fraction of what he could easily afford. Tech founders with net worths in the billions have built entire public identities around wearing the same simple outfit every day, not because they can't afford variety, but because the decision itself became irrelevant to them once visible variety stopped being the point. None of that is really about any specific person's quirks. It's the same underlying pattern showing up at a scale large enough that it becomes visible from the outside. not despite having enormous resources, but often because having enormous resources made the performance of having them feel unnecessary in the first place. So what does this actually look like in practice, if you wanted to apply it rather than just understand it? It's not about literally trying to look poor, which would be a strange and somewhat performative goal in its own right. It's about deliberately keeping the gap open between what you could visibly spend and what you actually do, especially in the years when that gap is doing the most work. A raise doesn't have to become a lifestyle upgrade the same month it arrives. Letting even half of it flow into savings and investing before the other half adjusts your baseline preserves the gap instead of closing it automatically. A car doesn't need to be replaced the moment a newer, nicer one becomes affordable. It needs replacing when the current one stops reliably doing its job. A move to a bigger home is worth separating from a raise entirely, asking whether the space is actually needed rather than treating "we can technically afford more now" as the only relevant question. And on social media specifically, it's worth noticing how much of what gets posted is chosen because it's photogenic rather than because it's meaningful, and treating other people's visible highlight reels as exactly that, rather than as an accurate scoreboard of who's actually ahead. None of this requires performing deprivation for anyone watching. Most of the people actually doing this aren't broadcasting it, which is sort of the entire point. The choice is invisible by design, which is exactly what makes it effective and exactly why it doesn't show up in the version of wealth most people picture when they imagine what making it looks like. That's really the whole idea underneath this video's title. Looking poor, in the narrow sense this video means it, isn't about deprivation, and it isn't a moral statement about people who spend visibly. It's a recognition that the version of wealth other people can see and the version of wealth that actually compounds over decades are frequently two different things, pulling in opposite directions, and that every dollar spent maintaining the first one is a dollar that isn't available to build the second. The people who understand that distinction early tend to end up, decades later, exactly where the neighbor with the 10-year-old sedan usually does, quietly ahead, in the number that was never actually on display in the first place. And the strange part is that almost nobody finds out. That's not a loss. For the people actually living it, it was never the point. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, looking past the obvious version of a financial idea to the mechanism actually driving it, that's what this channel is built around. If that's helpful, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one. The leased SUV in the driveway and the 10-year-old sedan next to it were never actually telling you who has more money. They were only ever telling you who decided that you needed to know.